Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. Please excuse me while I take some drugs. Obviously, not the harmful shit, the Nurofen. Let me be clear on that shit before I go any further, and before YouTube decides to have me done for that shit. Oh, much better. That should keep the toothache pain away for a while. Now, we are back with the Manifesto Book. And I believe we're on page 92. So I'll just move this out of the way. Make this a little bit easier for myself. So, let's begin, shall we? As George Bernard Shaw, God, I'm off to a good start, aren't I? One of the handful of dominant thinkers during the first 60 years of Britain's Fabian socialism, said of fascism and national socialism, and I quote, "Fascism, or the organization of the state as a hierarchy of..." I really am struggling with words today, and I've had a couple of hours up already. Anyway, as a hierarchy of industrial and professional corporations is right as far as it goes, but what real power will the corporations have unless they own the land and control the industries? Unless, that is, the state is socialist as well as fascist. Therefore, the persecution of socialists as socialists is even sillier than the persecution of Jews qua Jews. For if fascism is to come to anything, it must come to communism finally." End quote. To the Fabian socialists, Mussolini needed to go further left and behave like Stalin. You may not understand how important a person Shaw was in his day. Here is one measure. His book of short stories, The Adventures of the Black Girl in Her Search for God, sold 100,000 copies in England in 1932, the first year it was published. To give you a sense of how successful Shaw was by contrast, Orwell's book Homage to Catalonia was published in 1938, but only sold 1,000 copies by the time Orwell died in 1950. So the Nobel Prize winner Shaw, founder of the Fabian London School of Economics, was far more than 100 times more successful in his lifetime than was Orwell. Experts judged that in the 1920s, his glasses fell off, Shaw was probably the most famous person in the world. That decade, Shaw was offered a knighthood, but being a socialist, he refused it. In 1925, Shaw was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature. Shaw was so important that in 1931 he went to the Soviet Union for a meeting with Stalin. It's as if in our day, an author who combined the wealth and fame of Stephen King and the political credentials of Emmanuel Macron should support the National Socialists who control Ukraine. See Appendix 5. Across the West, since World War II, it is from this Stalinist perspective that socialists such as Mussolini and Hitler are regarded as far-right. If seen from the position of 19th century liberalism, it's clear that Mussolini and Hitler are as socialist as the name of Hitler's party declared. Nearly had a stroke there. But the oligarchy rely on the decades of propaganda to make you only see parts of the elephant and not see its other limbs. Between 1917 and 1921, leftists around Europe had watched as Bolshevism turned parts of Russian society against itself, a class war and then a civil war in Russia, and a totally devastated economy. Fascism was thus a leftist nationalist alternative to the civil strife of Bolshevik communism. But ever since Mussolini aligned himself with Hitler, the oligarchy's pet intellectuals have professed that fascism was some kind of mystical movement difficult to understand. Fascism was still a concept that was useful as a term of abuse applied to everyone they did not like. By 1944, Orwell was pointing out that fascist was being used to describe conservatives, communists, Trotskyists, Catholics, and those who supported World War II and those who opposed World War II. It isn't really that difficult to understand when the steps are explained, but the one consistent point the oligarchy don't want people to understand is that fascism was a form of leftist state planning, with much in common with what is being promoted by the oligarchy in the UK and the USA from the 1930s until today. Before the Thatcher Revolution, vast amounts of industry in Britain were owned by the state. Nationalisation is state planning. The oligarchy have just got smarter about concealing their fascism in recent decades. The state planning is still huge, as can be seen by the scale of taxation, which is now as high as in the decades following the 6 years when the UK had fought World War II. And the current high tax take is after 14 years of Conservative government who consistently promise lower taxes and reduced immigration and then ignored both of these promises, or sets of promises I should say. The state planning now is more obscured and works through taxation, interest rates, financial fraud, public services, quangos, etc., etc. Despite the appearance of there being a governing party and an opposition, it is in fact a one-party state, which we all well know about, it's two cheeks of the same ass, with massive state planning, coercion, censorship, and a systematically biased legal system. As late as 1937, prominent leftist academics in America were publishing books such as Planned Society, a symposium by 35 economics, sociologists, and statesmen, with articles by both Mussolini and Stalin chosen for that book on the Planned Society. That really was an awkward word I had to read there. Anyway, remember that the oligarchy can believe that they can engineer society to such an extent that they can control the weather of the planet and engineer biological gender. There are only two genders. Books such as the above were published by the most prestigious publishing companies. It's probable that there was no representative of National Socialism in that book, simply because the editor found that the racism of Hitler objectionable, not that he had any objection to Hitler's socialist planned state. The editor of that particular book was later elected to the American stroke number 2. Going a stroke a minute here. Where was I again? The Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and became a Knight of the British Empire. Extolling fascism and Stalinism as late as 1937 was no hindrance to promotion after World War II, for some of the oligarchy at least. So it can hardly be considered strange for the Marxist Michaels to admire Mussolini in 1928, no matter how jarring that might seem to free slaves. When it suits the oligarchy, any association with Mussolini will be used by the oligarchy to cast someone out as a witch, but only when it suits the oligarchy. Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists, is despised. George Bernard Shaw is treated as a national treasure. See chapter 5.4 below. Some propagandist of the oligarchy might tell you that Mussolini renounced socialism at some point along his journey. It isn't so. Mussolini remained a socialist until his last breath. He spent his final days in Salo implementing a constitution written by Nicola Bombacci, a communist and longtime friend of Lenin's. They were captured by a hand of communist partisans, who the next morning were ordered to execute him. Bombacci shouted, "Long live Mussolini, long live socialism." Bombacci was just one of the many Italian Marxists who joined Mussolini. Consider the Italian communists who executed Mussolini as Shia Muslims killing Sunni Muslims. One violent cult attacking another violent cult. Having dealt with that branch of socialism known as fascism, let us briefly examine Hitler. The case with Hitler should be even clearer with his National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler despised the bourgeois, traditionalists, aristocrats, monarchists, and all believers in the established order. Hardly the views of a right-wing conservative or a monarchist when it came to the party doctrine in 1920s. It was actually the familiar socialist ideas. Providing a livelihood for citizens, abolition of income from interest, the total confiscation of war profits, the nationalisation of trusts, big business, shared profits with labour, expanded old age pensions, communalisation of department stores. The execution of usurers, I think that's supposed to be usurpers, regardless of race, and the outlawing of child labour. I say that because it does look as if it was spelt wrong, though I could be wrong. Maybe I'll have to educate myself on this. 1 second. Oh no, it turns out it is actually a word. Learn something new every day. Apparently, it's a person who lends money at unreasonably high rates of interest. So the execution of usurers, regardless of race, and the outlawing of child labour. A violent revolutionary programme of big state socialist ideals, much of it based on hatred of tradition and on envy of those with more money than the workers. Like Britain's Fabian socialists, on the leaders of National Socialism, who were also advocates of human rights, animal rights, organic food and vegetarianism, the National Socialists famously were committed to eugenics, the selective breeding of a strong race, but Britain's Fabian socialists were equally committed to eugenics. In fact, Britain's Fabians invented modern eugenics. The removal of the inferior members of the nation was advocated by the chairman of the Labour Party and by leftist newspapers, The Guardian and The New Statesman, etc. So we shouldn't be surprised that leftist Michaels also advocated for eugenics. Race purification is a product of socialist welfare state thinking. To the oligarchy, we are seen as animals. They are herding and farming. Beveridge, as in Ridge, R-I-D-G-E, not beverage as in look what I got. Anyway, the socialist, regarded as a saint in Britain for creating the National Health Service, attended a meeting of the Eugenics Society on the very day that the House of Commons debated the famous Beveridge Report, which created the post-war welfare state. Indeed, during the 1930s, much of the planning for the welfare state was conducted at the Eugenics Society. As a eugenicist, the father of the welfare state advocated for imprisonment and sterilization of the disabled. Today, Beveridge is generally portrayed as a kindly, avuncular figure, one almost dripping with compassion and benevolence, but his roots were in a particularly hardline strand of eugenics. He argued that in 1909, those men who, through general defects, are unable to fill such a whole place in industry are to be recognised as unemployable. They must become the acknowledged dependents of the state, but with the permanent loss of all citizen rights, including not only the franchise, the vote, but civil freedom and fatherhood. Again, it is amazing how the oligarchy hide information in order to promote their religion of the welfare state. It wasn't just Beveridge in 1942. The economist J.M. Keynes, later Lord Keynes, was consulted on the creation of the NHS, and Socialist Keynes was vice president of the British Eugenics Society from 1937 to 1944, with Keynes endorsing eugenics from 1910 to his death in 1946. At the heart of the welfare state, the oligarchy, looking at the public as a collective farm to be kept healthy, to yield the most profit. We've no doubt that when the welfare state is in jeopardy in years to come, leftists will return to advocating for eugenics, euthanasia, and more. Well, we've already seen the legalised death bill, or whatever it's called, so that much is definitely correct. Considering that leftists believe that they can control the economy, control the climate, and engineer biological sex changes, of course they believe in eugenics, the state managing the breeding of the masses. If it had been Stalin rather than Hitler who was the genocidal eugenicist, leftists would still be pushing for eugenics. But the communists turned against eugenics in the 1930s as a practical way to distinguish themselves from National Socialism. Bolsheviks also abandoned the use of the swastika in the 1920s because the National Socialists started to use it. The Soviets used it on military badges up until 1922. Shaw was not the only Fabian advocate of communism, who was a supporter of genocide in the furtherance of the socialist utopia. The other preeminent Fabian, Sidney Webb and his stroke number 3, his wife, Beatrice Webb, thought it clumsy of Stalin to allow people to know about its genocide in Ukraine. Of course, the Fabian way to conduct genocide would be to do it gradually and slowly, so that the public could not perceive that extermination was going on, or to mask it as some sort of welfare program. The webs were so important to communism that decades before the 1917 revolution, whilst Lenin was exiled in Serbia for sedition, he translated the web's books on trade unionism. National Socialism was as left-wing as Fabianism, so we shouldn't be surprised if Hitler was also enthusiastic about race purification. In the 1930s, when the National Socialists began killing the unfit on the grounds of purifying the race, this was something that had been publicly advocated decades earlier by socialists in Britain and the USA. We are sure most of you never used the word I certainly haven't used it. Proletariat, I believe it's supposed to be, to refer to yourselves. But the communists used this term all along to refer to us. The meaning of the word is the lowest class of the community, regarded as contributing nothing to the state but offspring. Well, I haven't contributed offspring, so they can fuck off right now. Anyway, to the statists, the socialists of all parties, we are nothing but breeders. Livestock, sheep to be herded and farmed. They can't help but even use a fancy word to talk about us as livestock, knowing that we won't recognise its true meaning. The Trotskyist SWP and the communists of Antifa routinely refer to the working class as the proletariat. See, for example, the SWP book, The Prophet and the Proletariat, where the Trotskyists even, I'm really having trouble with my T's here, declare their allegiance to Islamic terrorism. The hatred of Jews in Germany was not that different between National Socialists and Communists. If we had looked at books written by Germans from the 1930s, books that were in no way admiring Hitler, and I nearly had another stroke, and National Socialism, we find things like this. A force of 3 million SA, the National Socialist militia men, were pushing on behind him, Hitler. There were large numbers of communists and Marxist social democrats among them. Many of the stormtroops were called beefsteaks, don't ask, brown outside and red within. One SA man says to another, in our stormtroop there were 3 Nazis, but we will soon have spewed them out. That observation was made by a German who had been a member of the Marxist Social Democratic Party of Germany, someone who fled Germany in 1933. In a later book, that same anti-Hitler German writer quotes Hitler thus, in our movement, the two extremes come together, the communists from the left and the officers and the students of the right. These two have always been the most active elements. The communists were the idealists of socialism. Our party has already succeeded in uniting these two utter extremes within the ranks of our stormtroops. They will form the core of the great German liberation. There were even utterly vicious and murderously anti-Jewish sentiments from German communist leaders at the time, which you would attribute to Hitler if you knew no better. For example, Ruth Fischer, founder of the Austrian Communist Party, in 1923, Fischer appealed to a group of Nazi students proclaiming that those who call for a struggle against Jewish capital are already gentlemen, class strugglers, even if they don't know it. You are against Jewish capital and want to fight the speculators. Very good. Throw down the Jewish capitalists. Hang them from the lampposts. Stamp on them. In their promotion of socialism and statism, the oligarchy would have you be deceived that socialists have been angels fighting devils, when Marx was the theoretician of genocide and his followers. I'm sorry, just that word really, it messes with me. And his followers, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, implemented genocide. As a diversion from hatred and division from Germans, Jew hatred became a way of uniting the German people, one of the many unifying concepts that all true Germans, rich and poor, could rally round. The only way in which these National Socialists could be seen as right-wing is if they are viewed from a Stalinist perspective, which is precisely how the oligarchy and liberal democracies have positioned Hitler's socialism. For Stalin, any deviation from the party line Prove the person was right-wing, a heretic. Deviate from Stalinism and you are far right, no matter that you're a socialist. Hitler's hatred for communism came from the fact that he believed that communism was a Jewish conspiracy. Some academics believe that the Jew hatred of the National Socialists stemmed from the insecurity and envy from the Germans who were not Jews. But since the moderate Fabian socialists in Britain were in favour of imprisoning and sterilising those in Britain they regarded as inferior, why are we surprised that Hitler's revolutionarily socialists in Germany would take this further? In 1911, long before Hitler had his German Workers' Party, before Hitler served on the Soviet government in Bavaria, Michaels was noting the anti-Semitism of German stroke number 4, German socialists throughout the 19th century. The socialists would have you believe that they have always opposed Jew hatred, but Jew hatred has been endemic to virtually every socialist movement, so Hitler's attitude was no different from most other socialists. Just need a moment here. Prior to World War II, most socialists and socialist parties of Europe held strong anti-Semitic opinions and railed against the capitalist middle class and wealthy, especially money-lending Jews. The phrase anti-Semitism was popularized by a 19th century German socialist as early as 1848, but not as a criticism of Jew hatred, but as a commendation of Jew hatred. His view was that anti-Semitism is a socialist movement only nobler and purer in form than social democracy. And as noted in Chapter 1, Britain's National Socialist Party was formed by a virulent Jew hater, and his MPs who were elected in 1918 merged with them, the people outside the collective who are the enemy. Oh, sorry, no, I've gone... Sorry, let me read that. And his MPs were elected in 1918, merged with the Labour Party. Collectivist ideologies need an us, the collective, and a them, the people outside the collective who are the enemy. Sorry for misreading that. Socialism, the socialism of the National Socialists should be seen as the basis of the Holocaust. Socialist George Bernard Shaw, praised to this day by the top British socialists, literally advocated in the BBC magazine The Listener, 7th of February 1934, for chemists to invent a gas that could be used to kill masses of people in a humane manner. In 1938, Shaw wrote another respected Fabian socialist. I think we ought to tackle the Jewish question by admitting the right of states to make eugenic experiments by weeding out any strains that they think undesirable, but insisting they do it as humanely as they can afford to, and not to shock civilization by such misdemeanors as the expulsion and robbery of Einstein. So to stroke number 5. Man alive, I am in a lot of trouble if I go to stroke number 6. So to Fabianism's founders and foremost thinkers, it wasn't racist genocide that was the problem in itself. It was about carrying out his genocide in a more civilized manner. A few years later, the National Socialists were putting this Fabian socialist ideas into practice with Zyklon B. Those who knew and admired Socialist Shaw reported that he recommended the liquidation of undesirables, and the great Fabian socialist claimed that Hitler should have given him credit for the idea of gas chambers. That's scary. To the oligarchy's moderate Fabian socialists, extermination isn't evil, but the extermination program for these Fabians has to be stage managed to make it acceptable to the masses. A left-wing London council has its theatre named after this respected socialist Shaw, and a slew of politically correct actors have performed there. Shaw admitted he applauded Mussolini and Hitler until they went off the rails. During World War II, Shaw wrote, and I quote, "We must not let Adolf Hitler give socialism a bad name. We are National Socialists. I was horrified when the New Statesman made the slip of denouncing National Socialism as the enemy instead of Hitlerism." End quote. emphasis added on Hitlerism. On the 8th of March 1940, Shaw was advising Americans not to take sides in World War II. While the Hitler-Stalin Pact was still in force, Shaw was writing about our old pal Stalin, in air quotes. Before World War II, Shaw had written, "Can you wonder at Hitler and how Mussolini driving out the Jews?" This is not to say that Shaw was a Jew-hating National Socialist. But as a Fabian, he believed in the communist utopia, and he was opposed to the idea that the masses should be allowed to make democratic decisions. He believed that the oligarchy should be in control, but they should be his kind of oligarchs. Shaw was opposed to racism, writing in 1935, "The future lies to the mongrel." Shaw stated in 1934 that he had, and I quote, "gone round the world shouting, 'I am a communist.' There is no public man in England more completely committed to communism, and in particular to the support of the Russian system, than I. Communism in Britain must be as British as the Fabian Society, before it can have the slightest weight internationally. Before any serious changes can be made in England, the parliamentary party system, with its mask of democracy, liberty, and all the rest of it, must be smashed, and be replaced by a constitution which will have a good deal in common not only with the Russian Bolshevik constitution, but also with the corporate state of Mussolini and the National Socialist state of Hitler." End quote. Britain's Fabian socialists, active to this day, set about incrementally turning Britain into a totalitarian state, modelled on what Lenin, Mussolini and Hitler had done. Shaw was one of the BBC's most privileged guests. Keynes' economics had been the oligarchy's means of controlling the West for almost a century. They may have been opposed to the bad publicity of killing Jews, but the oligarchy are happy to genocide those people they despise. And as we will show in Chapter 5, that's what they are doing to the indigenous people of Europe. Professor Hayek said in his best-selling book, The Road to Serfdom, 1944, that few are ready to recognize that the rise of fascism and Nazism was not a reaction against the socialist trends of the preceding period, but a necessary outcome of the tendencies. It was the socialists who first insisted that the party member should distinguish himself from others by the modes of greeting and forms of address. It was they who by their organization of cells and devices for the permanent supervision of private life, created the prototype of the totalitarian party. Despite numerous experts from pointing out that Hitler and Mussolini were socialists, what has happened in the last 70, 80 years is that the left have attempted to protect their cult of socialism from its genocidal offspring such as Hitler. But to do that, they also have to ignore the genocides committed by socialists like Stalin, Mao and Pol Pot. Leftism has continued to be the dominant ideology even among so-called conservatives, in name only. In the British context, those conservatives who supported the anti-democratic European superstates used the tactics of Stalin to demonize people such as Enoch Powell, who was strongly opposed to the UK entering the EU. If Powell hadn't been cast out as a witch, but had instead become leader of the Con-Socialist Party, which was a possibility in the 1960s, Britain might have had a party these last 60 years that was actually conservative. It is sobering to think, hey, that's my line. It's sobering to think that in Britain, the oligarchy have despised Powell for decades, but they happily embrace intolerant Muslims and communists and give them positions of power, including passing hate speech laws while exempting the hate speech and terrorist doctrines of stroke number 6. I'm going to get a bollocking for this now. Doctrines of Islam and communism from these laws. Let's not also forget the fact that there's already a Labour MP trying to call in for blasphemy laws, and another Labour Muslim MP that's trying to call for defending first cousin marriages. And I've already made it quite clear in a video regarding inbreeding, what the damaging effects of that can be. You might think it extreme to deem the party of Boris Johnson consocialists, but if we pay attention to what Thatcher's guru, Professor Hayek, had to say, it will be less surprising. When Hayek explained why he was not a conservative, the tug-of-war between conservatives and progressives can only affect the speed, not the direction of contemporary developments. Hayek observed in 1960 that the only difference between the left and the supposed right is a matter of how fast the leftist agenda is being implemented. As a young man, Hayek had been a socialist at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution in Germany. In the subsequent years, Hayek turned against the state and collectivism towards the free market and individual freedom, whilst Hitler stayed with socialism, statism, and collectivism. Hayek has made his anti-conservative declaration a decade before the Consocialists merged the UK into the anti-democratic EU superstate, and 4 decades before the Consocialists started to promote Islam, transgenderism, minimum wages, etc., etc. For decades, the Consocialists in Britain claimed that they would limit immigration, but instead they sped up tenfold the leftist programme of population replacement. Clearly, the plan is that we farmed animals should end up as a disunited nation of mongrels, as the eugenic Fabian socialists so desired. And if there is any difference between Fabian socialists and the Consocialists, it is only with regard to the speed of the change, not the direction of travel. Those with the power to control academia, publishing, journalism, the media and politics would all have it that Stalin was left-wing whilst Hitler was right-wing. But take a look at Appendix 9, where an AI bot was asked to put the politics of Stalin, Hitler and Hayek into a comparative table. You can see for yourself that Stalin and Hitler are virtually identical, whilst Hayek is entirely different, yet Hitler gets put in the same far-right grouping as people like Hayek and Margaret Thatcher. Virtually every modern name defamed as far-right would share the politics of Thatcher and Hayek, yet every virtue-signalling leftist is too blind, deceitful, or ignorant to realise that it's the leftists who should be grouped alongside Hitler and Stalin. Britain's big state, pro-tax, pro-censorship, anti-democratic, anti-British Consocialist Party has more in common with Hitler and Stalin than it has with Hayek and Thatcher. The Consocialist Party that brought in a communist aristocrat to control public behaviour during the COVID pandemic, or scamdemic if you want to call it that, would have you believe that Tommy Robinson is far right, so you won't see how similar are the policies of the Consocialists to the policies of Hitler and Stalin. After that detour into how many supposedly right-wing ideologies are actually socialist, let us return to the problem of the oligarchy and their control of democracy. You might know people who will readily fall into the groove of thinking Jews are the oligarchy, but we will show later, in chapter 3.7, how even in Israel there is an oligarchy at work. Michael's analysis applies to organizations of any size, all of them, including the organizations that run the state of Israel. Communist China will also be controlled by an oligarchy, and it's likely there's not a Jew amongst them. We will now turn to how the oligarchy openly boasts of how they need to be in control of the masses in our so-called liberal democracies. Amongst politicians and would-be politicians, it is basically an open secret that they regard us, the public, as dumb animals to be farmed. That is their ideology. It is largely kept out of the view of the masses, but if you know where to look, you can find them discussing it openly. Now, we move on to chapter 3.4, Democratic Elitism. Perhaps as surprising as Michael's turn towards charismatic dictators, or maybe I was right first time, such as Mussolini, is an alternative response to the recognition that democracy is actually an oligarchy run by elites for their own enrichment. This other reaction to the pessimism brought about by the analysis of Michael's is the oxymoron known as democratic elitism. This has been the dominant, mostly unspoken attitude of the oligarchy since the time of Michael's. Michael's analysis led to other men to strikingly different conclusions and suggested the need to redefine the concept of democracy to elaborate the elitist theory of democracy. Many of these have stressed that the distinctive and most valuable element of democracy is the formation of the political elite in the competitive struggle for the votes of the mainly passive electorate. Democracy in the sense of a system of decision making, democracy in the sense of a system of decision making in which all members or citizens play an active role in the continuous process is inherently impossible. We're sure that virtually no one outside of academia knew that this is how the oligarchy was justifying themselves, their hypocrisy and self-enrichment. They talk of democratic values to the public, but all the while, amongst themselves, the oligarchy agree that they are the elite and they must rule, while pretending to the masses that the masses have control. Cast your mind back to the 1958 quotation from Aldous Huxley at the start of the book. Democracy and freedom will be the theme of every broadcast and editorial. Meanwhile, the ruling oligarchy and its highly trained elites of soldiers, policemen, thought manufacturers, and mind manipulators will quietly run the show as they see fit. As a young man, Huxley had been involved with the Fabian Society in 1911. Just to show how pervasive is this ideology of democratic elitism within the study of politics at university, consider the student textbook, The Irony of Democracy. This book teaches the American political system from the perspective of democratic elitism, that is in reality a tiny handful of people that make decisions that shape the lives of all of us, and despite the elaborate rituals of parties, elections, and interest group activity, we have little direct influence over these decisions. Those authors make no judgment on this. Just say that since it is true that the perspective from which students are taught, the book has been continually updated and has been in use since first published in 1970, with the latest edition we found printed in 2016. So students are being taught how things really work. It's just the general public, the farmed animals, who are told that criticism of the anti-democratic elite controlling politics is a conspiracy theory. To keep the masses quiet, they are distracted by hundreds of TV channels, football, celebrity gossip, social media, computer games. Sadly, I fall under that category. I'm sorry, I should be ashamed of myself. Anyway, gambling, health scares, etc., etc. While the next generation of the elite are trained about who really rules, about how to justify bringing in the replacement livestock in the management of us farmed animals. In the 2010 book Democratic Elitism, New Theoretical and Comparative Perspectives, the academics state that democratic elitism is the institutional arrangement by which political leaders and elites engage in a competitive struggle for the people's vote. There were many books written between 1940 and 2010 explaining this conception of democracy. Under this theory, provided that the oligarchy is made up of a variety of overlapping oligarchies, it doesn't matter that the masses have virtually no say in what happens. There is no manipulation, as long as there is a rule by elites, not by an elite. That's the summary of the views of a Yugoslavian aristocratic professor of social and political theory who died in 1975, having spent most of his working life indoctrinating students at Oxford University. In Italy, Giovanni Sartori, who ended up not only as a professor at the University of Florence, but also in the USA at Stanford and Columbia, was coming out with the similar views. The key to the survival of democracy, in Sartori's eyes, rests in the hands of the ruling elite, an elite whose power is based on recognized superiority. Is it any wonder that the mercenaries in the media refer to any opposition to the oligarchy as thugs and scum? Unless, of course, the opposition comes from one of the protective mascot groups, such as Muslims. These academics could succeed with these brazenly elitist and anti-democratic theories, all while the media oligarchy and the politicians talk up liberal democracy, while their class are quietly being indoctrinated at the top universities that naturally the oligarchical rule is true democracy. Even in a book that is highly critical of the square circle of democratic elitism, after explaining the problems with a dozen of these prominent elitist indoctrinators, the author concludes, the illiberal and anti-democratic propensity of the common man is an undeniable fact that must be faced. It is time to abandon the myth of the common man's allegiance to democracy. The oligarchy professes democracy as a way of validating their rule. They believe that the common man is anti-democracy, but liberal democracy must be extolled at all times and by everyone, so that when democracy always leads to rule by the oligarchy, their rule is seen as a natural, and that the only alternative is some kind of fascist tyranny. All of this is to conceal that they are tyrants. The oligarchy manage democracy just as they believe they can manage the economy and manage the climate. Populism is merely democracy over which the oligarchy have lost a degree of managerial control, and populism might result in some effort by the oligarchy to get their management of the masses back on track. Some resistance to this tendency towards oligarchy among the leadership can occur if the representatives in a democracy are chosen for the public at random, and those representatives only have a limited time in positions of power. But in a representative democracy where the leadership continues for years, it will result in oligarchy. Michael points out that he wasn't the first to realize there was a problem here. Or the problem, I should say. Rousseau may be considered as the founder of this aspect of the criticism of democracy. The instance of people give itself to stroke number 7 gives itself to representatives is no longer 3. Rousseau, The Social Contract, 1762. A mass of people which delegates its sovereignty, that is to say, transfers its sovereignty to the hands of a few individuals, abdicates its sovereign functions. The oligarchy in the West glibly, God, words are hard, throw around allusions to Rousseau's book, The Social Contract. But these same people ensure they steer well away from this criticism of the impossibility of representative democracy. Unless you have studied the history of political thought, you may not know who Rousseau is. Suffice to say, he is probably one of the 10 most well-known political philosophers of the last 2,000 years. There's an additional complication that contemporary Western democracies face, a problem that Michaels could not have envisaged. He saw that stroke number 8, that Europe's multi-ethnic countries were hoping that the political nation could be at least the end of ethnic division. Not an end to how many strokes I'm having, though, unfortunately. Michaels could not have envisaged that the oligarchy would knowingly import millions of unintegratable people from halfway around the world, aka their third world shitholes, with incompatible ethnic, religious, and cultural behaviours, i.e. Islam. As Michael said, the principle of nationality cannot help us where nationalities can hardly be said to exist or where they are entangled in inextricable confusion. The managerial elite, under the ideology of democratic elitism, are intentionally managing the replacement of the population in the West. They began openly planning this by the end of the 20th century in United Nations documents. See Appendix 2 and 3. In academic journals, and in the quality newspapers, I was right first time, like The Guardian. The managerial elite can do this because they know the masses are not paying attention to the discussions of the elite. And the elite know that should the masses start to pay attention, they can use the smear tactics racist and far right to divert the attention away from the electorate, of the electorate away from those exposing what oligarchy are doing. Whilst implementing an elite-managed totalitarian state as conceived by the Fabians, Lenin, Mussolini, and Hitler, the oligarchy denounces far-right those who object to the oligarchy's genocidal plans. You will own nothing, and you will be happy. And that is the end of the session. We're on page 103 right now, and I ended it just before the start of chapter 5.5. So I will go into something very briefly. Unfortunately, I admit I have been kind of distracted from the real world because I am a very, very hardcore video gamer. Some people may go as far to say I am an addict of video games, especially considering that I've played video games for at least every day, like 4 or 5 hours a day. That's bare minimum, and that's usually on my work days. Whenever I'm off of work, like I have been Thursday, since I had to go to the dentist, and I've been off today as well, although ironically I ended up waking up, oh sorry, Friday. Ironically, that day I woke up at the fucking time that I would leave work, because my sleep got completely skewed, because I made the god-awful mistake of not having enough drugs. And when I ran out of drugs, oh my god, did I suffer without sleep. But back on the point of video gaming, generally speaking, a lot of these times I will spend at least 8 hours a day on video games. You could say it's an addiction, quite frankly. And I wouldn't blame anybody who says that shit. But that's because I mainly want to get my head out of the real world. I can't stay 24/7 in the real world thinking about politics. If I do that shit, I'm going to have a mental breakdown. And trust me, I don't need that. I really don't need that. So, yeah, basically, I want to not be in a situation where I'm going to be a wreck. After all, I've got to balance it all. You know, a balanced diet, which is for me is a cake in each hand. Anyway, it's got to at least be some kind of balance between the real world and gaming, which is why you sometimes hear me say I spend like 7 or 8 hours a day on these kinds of things. I mean, if I really wanted to commit myself to YouTube, I could probably sink in 2 or 3 hours a day doing this, quite frankly. I don't want to go OTT with it, though, because I don't want it to massively affect my mental health. Besides, the more exposure I get to YouTube, the more of my messages are going to get listened to by the police, and then Keir the traitor Starmer will send his stormtroopers after me, and then you're going to have a hard time busting me out of prison. Not that I would encourage anybody to commit any crimes, but I digress. The bottom line is, even I have been affected to some degree by this aspect of I'm not in the know, as it were, or I'm part of the general public that doesn't know about the oligarchies. But now I'm starting to learn about this, obviously thanks to the book. But we'll see what happens, and I will see about how much more I can learn from this, and hopefully I can try and get the strokes that I'm having down. I know someone was saying in one of the videos I only had 1 stroke, ironically, tried to keep the number of strokes down to 5 per episode. Well, I've gone over and beyond that shit, let me tell you. But I've waffled on enough. I've taken up enough of your time, 47 fucking minutes. You will never get that time back. And nor will I, unfortunately. That's the thing. If I have to suffer, you have to suffer as well. But no, I wish you all a good morning, afternoon, or evening. And I'll see you in the next one. And we'll see what happens in the manifesto.